See what we got here.
Hello
Nice.
and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined again by Mike Buhl.
Yeah,
So, Mike,
boy.
welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Right, so there's a lot of directions that we could go into. So I wanted to start perhaps with this podcast I was listening to by Will Storr, and who was on the Joe Rogan Experience
Right.
podcast, one of the most famous podcasts out there. And I didn't read his book, but he was kind of presenting his main idea that
Mhm.
um, life is basically about playing social status games, and that even if you go back to like really old history, right? People within, let's say, tribal communities, they want to show off that they were able to hunt the most amount of wild game, right? That the wild game that they hunted was bigger than the neighbor, right? Um,
Yeah.
and then even later on, right? We still pursue that. And then, of course, you have the era of industrialization, the era of capitalism, right? When people are starting to compete for jobs. They compete for investments, right? Entrepreneurs. They're competing for the largest amount of loans that they can raise, the pace at which they can grow their business, earn revenues, etc. Um, and and now it comes the last act, which is that if you look at the developed capitalist world over the last 40 plus years since the onset of Reaganomics and neoliberalism, we are basically seeing that the the young generation has a much harder time ascending the economic ranks. That in fact they might be experiencing downward social mobility compared to their own parents, or some kind of stagnation. And what this results in is that the you know e- the status games that we're playing today has basically shifted from the economic realm, right? From
Mhm.
going to a good college, middle class jobs, etc. Um, onto you could say
Culture.
yeah, culture, like social status games, which you know, some people derogatorily summarize as virtue signaling, right?
Sure.
Whether it is, being part of the environmental movement, or whether it's, uh, you know, racial inequality, there's different kinds of topics, or even from even the right wing perspective about, well, we've got to fight abortion right now, we've got to defend gun ownership by all means, etc. I mean, so I don't want to make it a left or right issue.
Mhm.
Simply to say that if the economic struggle is not working out because our young people just do not have these opportunities as they used to, then the status games are simply shifting onto the cultural realm.
Okay.
And that's a really interesting observation, I think.
Yeah. I the whole status games and this, I think, tendency among the youth, and it's carrying over to social media and kind of battle for recognition and struggle, in this new economy of, the way I actually see this theoretically is really closely related to Ulrich Beck. He had this term he used in one of his book. He wrote the book with his wife. She's still alive, but Ulrich Beck died. The term that reminds me is institutionalized individualization. That was the two-term phrase that he used. So these status games seem to closely relate to hyper individualization. And I think that even nowadays, when I have this discussion with my students about Taylor Swift, and this phenomenon in popular culture, right? There is a kind of hyper individualism where individualism is a new brand, and it seems to, lure a lot of people into oversharing, creating social media accounts, right? So there's, again, it seems to be a focus again on individuals themselves. And I think maybe a lot of the companies want this too. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if you have more people joining social media accounts, it can create more revenues, right? Advertisement revenues, and even music listeners. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, young generation uh, does consume significantly, and they do consume a lot of things, whether it's music, okay, uh, social media, etc. I wouldn't expect the same thing with the older generation. Maybe some of the older generation, they just may not have the technology savvy to quite understand. But even like myself, I come from the 80s generation. We had the first Nintendo console, right? Very primitive. But now, when you have a, a lot of the youth that can play video games on their phones, uh, they, there's just more of a I think, hyper individualization, and you see it across variety of fields. And like you said, I mean, the book that you mentioned, Status Games, it does start to become, I guess, a struggle for recognition, individual recognition in a very uncertain world, of employment, educational outlooks. It might explain also why there's the decline of enrollment. I don't know. This seems to be a drop. They're predicting this cliff of young people are not enrolling in colleges and universities like they used to, like 20, 30 years ago. So, real concern, definitely.
Well, I mean, regarding the college
Yeah.
education, I mean, there's a concern just about demographics, right? So I think that in 2026, I think just 2 years away, that's when the demographic cliff will start to take an impact, because the post 2008 cohorts are significantly smaller than the prior ones. But
Mhm.
but we have started to see the enrollment declines as early as 2020, right? So it's the
Mhm.
first year of the pandemic, and people were trying to take a break from college, presumably because the in-person experience was going to be removed, um, and um, um, and of course, you couldn't drop out from primary, secondary school because it might be a school educational requirement, but
Mhm.
college, is not seen as a requirement. So I think that the demand is, as you could say, more elastic. That is to say,
Mhm.
more sensitive to things happening in society and economy. Um, so yeah, so colleges, I think we are facing quite some legitimacy challenge, more or
Mhm.
less. And the colleges, they will try to push harder to basically make
Yeah.
the case that we're offering a valuable product.
Yeah.
Um,
I I wanted to add one thing. What I found interesting, esports, the phenomenon of esports. We're used to traditional athletics that are appealing, but now there's increasingly a lot of colleges that offer esports scholarships. Now, those are literally professional video game players that receive academic scholarships. So that's shows you, I think there's an attempt to also appeal to this new demographic of when we think of sports, we think of the stadium sports and the football, right?
where you have to be
Uh,
physically athletic, right? So
yeah, but
you
now
have to be able to catch balls and stuff.
you have esports programs, and I found that interesting, fascinating. Esports, we think of like people playing video games, but they have real scholarships for that now. So I wonder if they're trying to tie into this new demographic, of new students, of new interests and new values, and new orientation that's very different from last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, so if you remember the Michael Burawoy literature, labor
Mhm.
sociology,
Right.
on gamification of labor, gamification of work,
Oh.
which I think it's a very insightful concept, right? Because I mean, essentially, I mean, he kind of asks a question, how why do people work so hard even though they're being exploited by the capitalist system, right? I mean, if capitalism is alienating, if it's disappointing to people, then the most rational thing to do is to do the absolute minimum, right? To wait for your to be disciplined by your boss in order to do anything. And in his study, he kind of finds that workers are actually willing to work hard if you can turn the work into a game, right? Because
Gamification.
yeah, because in any kind of game where it's about, adding or scoring points, you can feel that it's it produces a carnal pleasure that gets satisfied. So I mean, I notice. I mean, the game that I play in the evening is always
Mhm.
solving jigsaw puzzles,
Oh.
and on just on the website, because when you drag, click with a mouse, and let's say the two pieces fit together, there's always this like little clack sound from the computer, and it's very pleasing. And
Yeah.
it tells you that games are like a carnal pleasure, you could say. Um, yeah, there was another book by Johann Huizinga. I think he's a Dutch
Yeah.
historical anthropologist, and he wrote a history of the playful human, right? So the Homo ludens, and he basically argues that games are as old as our species, right? And so I mean, yeah, so I
Hmm.
mean, you have the two main features, right? You got the status, um,
Right.
status seeking, and then you can gamify the status seeking as well, right?
How, I have to ask as a follow-up, how different is this from Ritzer's book, The McDonaldization? I mean, it's still a form of re-rationalization, but now there's gamification. I mean, I guess if you use a Marx critique, a kind of commodity fetishism that comes out of, I mean, you're trying to make you would like to see a job like a game. So I don't know if would you rather have a Weberian look at it, or could you see a Marxist critique of this whole process? Like you said, gamification. I'm trying to really understand it theoretically, but I think it's trying to turn it into a game, right? Or there's an appeal for young people to see jobs that are like, I guess, drone operators, these new jobs that they have now where they fly the Walmart groceries to the um, residents nearby, and where the job can be appealing, but if you turn it into something like a recreational, even to some extent, I don't know, like what do you call those taxi service, DoorDash, it's small, short gig jobs. They're really simple, short gig jobs, but they can also be appealing to people, so people start treating it as a game. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a
Yeah.
good question about
Yeah.
like gaming and rationalization. I think that so within the capitalist economy, I would say that the games are in the pursuit of these irrational goals, right, of profit maximization. And that's what makes it more insidious, if you accept the Burawoyan framework, right? Uh, because in a way, so with the game, I mean, there seems to be this agency, right? Because if you go back to Weber and Marx,
Mhm.
they were very much concerned about human agency. I mean, how much do we control?
Right.
our personal fates. And you know, the argument about, you know, alienation and rationalization is that we don't have any agency. And you know, gamification seems to return a level of agency back to us,
Hmm.
because we design something as being a game, and therefore we're willingly playing that game. But because that game is in the pursuit of those rational goals, um, you know, it's still like you're
Hmm.
still removing the agency, right? In the final
Yeah.
analysis, right? Even though in the moment you feel like you have the agency, but because you're in the service of those rational goals,
Hmm.
you in fact do not have the agency. Um,
Hmm.
and you're basically you know, boxing yourself in.
Yeah.
Um, so
So
I,
go ahead. Go. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, so this debate about structure versus agency, sort of reappears. But like you said, the dilemma is even with this gamification process and trying to open up, encourage more agency, structures, economic structures still have economic incentives and economic motives underlying profit. So that's the contradiction that even with the attempt to make it appealing, uh, it still has this underlying contradiction. I guess that's what we're trying to say. If I'm re-summarizing it.
but that's right, yeah. So,
uh,
and then ultimately, I think, you know, we want to ask the question, well, how do you restore the agency? And I think, so I'm right now working on this book chapter
oh wow, let's hear it.
that deals with how to expand workplace democracy, right? So, which can include things like, you know, labor union organization, co-determination, works councils, any kind of like participatory structure on behalf of workers. And I make the claim that, you know, you need to have universal basic income, and it becomes the economic precondition towards achieving workplace democracy. I think that, you know, scholars who exclusively focus on you know, describing the desirable institutional designs within workplaces and organizations, I think they're, well, the heart is in the right place, but I think they don't pay enough attention to specify the mechanisms as to how to get to those um, democratic workplaces. And
Mhm.
I think that, you know, if that is what a goal is, I think that that we have to think much broader. That we have to think about the basically how to create a synergy between the government's social policies with the you know, labor market arrangements that could be expected from that. And I think those two, I think, have to be thought together, not separately. And so, and why is the UBI connected to the workplace democracy?
Mhm.
It goes back to this argument about the permanent strike fund of the UBI. Right now, there is a significant amount of power that employers have over workers simply by what Michal Kalecki called the power of the sack. Right, the ability to fire you
Yeah.
and you know,
Yeah.
threaten you with economic deprivation and destitution. And I think that this diminishes the amount of voice that people, that workers will have at the workplace. And that we know that if there are escape options, right, where if you know, were fired, you were able to, you know, use the UBI and you can retrain for new jobs, or um, you know, the employer just wouldn't be able to fire you, really, does not
Mhm.
have that power of economic deprivation over your head.
Yeah.
um, and I think that would substantially alter the power balance within the economy, and I think that would be a better economy, right?
So ultimately, the UBI would give more autonomy to workers, so they could use their labor and decide where they would like to use the labor and not be forced into a circumstance where they feel like their autonomy is threatened. But UBI would be like a universal kind of protection and right from that standpoint. That's
That's
how I
right.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the permanent strike fund is the key idea here because,
Mm,
um, the employers, they kind of uh, expect that, even if, let's say, you have a powerful labor union that has a lot of union dues, and they would usually be able to pay off a certain percentage of the salary of the workers while they're on strike.
right.
But they're kind of betting that the strike fund is eventually going to exhaust itself. And this will definitely happen. I mean, if it's a long strike, which could, a month or more, it could severely undercut the resources of the union. And at that point, they would have to come back to work.
Hmm.
And so and with the UBI, I mean, there's no way that the government um, would be allowed to reduce the UBI allocation to striking workers, right? You're not able. I mean, this is a citizen right, right? I mean, you're not
Yeah, yeah.
tying that to any condition of employment, right? So
And it couldn't be used as blackmail, or
that's
something like
right.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
and of course, I mean, with the UBI, I mean, you're not going to be rich,
right.
but you're going to be able to sustain yourself financially, like rent and food and stuff. Um, and um, and I think that this would be the precondition to a much more humane economy. And I think that it would also diminish some of when we started the conversation on the status games,
Yeah,
that anxiety surrounding
anxiety.
those status games, I think, are going to be much more diminished. Um, Now, but then if we accept, Will Storr's argument that
Mm,
status games is what makes us humans, I mean, it's a big question whether, um, even in a UBI world, that whether, we would get rid of status games altogether, and whether it's desirable to do so. Um, and so I
uh,
do agree with Storr's argument that I think uh, we love status
yeah.
games, right? Yeah.
Well, let me do a follow-up question with status games. If I read you correctly, again, I haven't read the book, but it sounds very close to Keeping Up with the Joneses. But there's a cultural emphasis of permanently trying to keep up with the Joneses with cars, status, houses, just everything that can be produced in our society as a market form, that it almost encourages a keeping up with the Joneses, that you're always trying to get this new product, get this new phone, or you're coerced to get this new phone or new car. Uh, so I don't know. What do you think? This sounds like with the old keeping up with the Joneses dilemma that everybody wants to just get a look at their neighbor and achieve what their neighbor has, and then this becomes the whole status games, I guess, war in the future. Uh, and it's accelerated because there's more and more products and more things that are produced out there. What do you think? It sounds like to me the old keeping up with the Joneses dilemma. How
Yeah,
to, yeah, no,
for sure. Yeah, and
or
and
some,
and
yeah, or some bourgeois utopia. I don't know, something in the middle class that's everybody would like to have the Tesla, the new Cybertruck or whatever, or the new whatever gadget it is. And then this becomes status games. Oh, I have got it now. He has to have it, and she has to have it too. And yeah, that's how I see it. I don't know. It could be. When I
no,
heard the words, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
that's a fair argument. I think that keeping up with Jonas is one of
Mhm.
the big motivations, and I would say that your capitalism and industrial society is definitely making it much worse, right? Because I mean, yeah, again, always go back to this mythical hunter gatherer who doesn't really have that much. I mean, sure you can have status games. I mean, you can compare, who hunts the bigger wild game, right? But because the total wealth that was generated under those, ancient societies, um, the total wealth was so small that the distinctions that existed between people was absolutely minimal, right? I mean, even the chief of a tribe, in terms of clothing, would still be wearing rags, just like just like
Mm,
the common members in the tribe, right?
yeah.
Um, but the more wealth, the more surpluses that you generate, first of all, you have a much more complex social hierarchy, right? So you have, the king, and the 21st century equivalent would be the president, or the CEO of a major company. Um, that would, in terms of his consumption
Mm,
abilities, would be far removed from the common people, right?
mm,
And would actually be physically separated, probably, flying around in helicopters rather than being stuck in the traffic jam in the highway during rush hour. Yeah, so the social separation increases, and the and you could say that the status games are becoming seemingly more high stakes, right? Even though
mm,
absolute standard of living is much higher today.
mm.
So yeah.
Go ahead. Quick follow-up on that. How do you tie in status games and the relationship to Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption? You think there are parallels to that, or there's that's stretching it? Status games is a middle class ideal, and or some preference for certain lifestyle and taste, and Veblen's, I know this is 1890, I think, when he wrote it, the leisure class, conspicuous consumption. Is that fair? That it does simulate a kind of conspicuous consumption behavior, at least that you're always consuming, or you want to present a kind of taste and lifestyle. That's not
Yes,
working. That's not tied to working manual labor, but tied to some kind of a, consumer quality or some kind of a distinction that makes you different from working people. Is that
yes,
fair?
yes, is
Yeah.
absolutely fair. So of course, by the time that Veblen wrote his theory, that's when he started to observe this particular pathology within industrial societies, right? So if you go back even, like, maybe like two generations before Veblen was Marx, and he was talking about, the industrial economy, right? He was talking about the factories, and industrialization, and that's kind of, where our ideas of, you could say, like
Mhm.
the normative industrial society, where it came from. But Veblen made a very different observation, which is that the result of industrialization, is the increase of economic surplus, right?
Mhm.
And the increase in economic surplus then creates a middle class, right? Especially the upper middle class, and also the rich, that that does not have, industrial labor as kind of the main objective.
Mhm.
Um,
More consumption, right?
yeah, so yeah, right. So in a way, so because you could say that, if you go back to the Burrow example, right? So if you
Mhm.
were an industrial laborer, I mean, you could play a status game while going to work, right? Because you are working faster than the other coworkers, right? You produce more than your coworkers. But if you are, let's say, an accountant for, like a big corporation, or if you are, even what we're doing, a university professor, right? We don't really like it doesn't like that kind of industrial logic, industrial efficiency argument kind of does not really apply to us. And therefore we would start to find, well, I mean, either we have to find something that mimics industry, right? Like for instance, for professors it would be grants that they receive or publications on the
Mhm.
CV,
Citation index, yeah.
citation index, things like that. So we would have to find something that mimics the productivity of the industrial sector,
Uh,
or we have to distinguish ourselves via the consumer items that we obtain, and that we can show off to others, or
mhm,
the leisure activities that we choose to perform, right? Um, I remember when I went to college, with like upper middle class kids,
mhm,
and one of the common conversation topics would be the like what they did for spring break, like doing really I mean, and of course as a working class kid, I mean, it's like, you know, it's not something that you necessarily can compete with, because my experience was simply to stay home and read books, right? But for the more well-off students, it would be going skiing, it would be going on a safari trip or something, right?
mhm.
It would be, um, yeah, I mean, doing some like outdoor camping or something like that. So, I mean,
Right.
and by recounting these kinds of leisure activities, um, I think you're also, communicating to your conversation partner the social status that you
Yeah,
inhabit. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So
And social rank, I guess, prestige, in a Bavarian sense. Yeah.
yeah. So social status is definitely
Let's
quite
uh,
important.
maybe I could follow up a little bit more. What's your opinion on extreme status games as they're presented in uh, what's his famous TV show, Squid Game, or Hunger Game movies as an extreme status game, like a battle presented in sci-fi movies. Do you think there's any, and why there's an appeal for a market for people to watch this stuff, Do you think there's anything relationship between those two, or is it just too extreme to make that assumption that uh, I mean, why is there an appeal? And I remember when Squid Game came out, the South Korean TV show on Netflix series, was it 2 years ago, I think?
Yeah, I didn't
I
watch that, so,
you
so
didn't
you,
want,
you
yeah,
might
yeah.
want to introduce a little bit what
Well,
the
yeah,
content of Squid Games.
yeah. Squid Games is a kind of dystopian TV show where individuals that are down on their luck or at very low, have hard depth issues, are given an opportunity to compete in a show where death is a reality, or there's killings on the show. And people have criticized, the whole narrative of these kind of shows. The same thing with Hunger Games, the whole Hunger Games movies that have come out last few years, one after the other, have also kind of pushed this radicalized, competition between individuals, where death is seen as a legitimate outcome almost. So I'm asking, I know it's kind of extreme, but like we sometimes see it with reality TV kind of shows pushing the envelope or pushing the boundary to what's acceptable, as far as status seeking, or trying to give people counts on your YouTube video or something. That's a more extreme form, but I guess we're sort of just focusing on the normal status seeking or normal status games, I guess. So yeah, there are. I mean, there seems to be a movie industry, or at least portion of the movie industry, that kind of goes more radical on this. Far more radical than we would expect. So
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, so if you talk about, um, like tournaments, I mean, effectively, that's what these TV shows are about, right? So, you have people that are, um, you know, competing, and the prizes maybe that you advance in some way, a level. And if you lose, you might die from it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a very high stakes
Definitely.
tournament. And yeah, and it is. I mean, so if death is kind of the outcome, I mean, think of like gladiator, right? I mean, that principle, right? In ancient Rome, right, where the masses had to be entertained,
Like a
because
circus, you know.
yeah, those city residents, I mean, they were not farmers, right? They were not doing, and they were also not soldiers, so they were not doing any of the essential functions in Roman society. And then they had to be entertained, by these gladiators, that would be trained in, like, sword fighting and physical agility. They would fight with these animals, lions and stuff. And those lions could ultimately kill the gladiator, right?
Mhm.
And the public, the unemployed public, that are the visitors, they would be cheering on, right? I mean, actually, if they see blood, if they see the gladiator being chewed up, because he lost the battle, um, that becomes the entertainment of the day, right? Um, and I do think that this element of gamification, um, it becomes even more important for sure if, y- if you don't have something meaningful to do during the day, right? I mean, if there is nothing that provides you with structure, then those games would have to give that to you.
An outlet for frustration or an outlet to kind of like as a reliever of stress or is that what you're
Um,
getting at?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And unfortunately, yeah, it's um, so people who are working in, you could say, the modern bread and circus industries, right? So if you are, going back to this esports, right? I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
you were the esports game designer, right? You are in effect doing a great service to the economy, to the society, because there is large demand. I mean, we have people that have, significant amounts of free time, and they don't feel like they have a useful outlet to spend their days. Maybe this is the right thing to do for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, though, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, there is this big question nowadays about, what are the limits to AI capabilities? Um, because I mean, even with, esports, you could give certain instructions to ChatGPT or to any of these, generative AI
Mm-hmm.
tools, um, to basically design things and produce outcomes that are as good, if not better, than what humans
Yeah.
would create. I mean, one thing I find, I mean, I just was watching a video last night. It was just like a short video, telling data scientists, data analysts, what can you do with generative AI, to basically write you whole lines of computer code. Um, and you can just, copy and paste that onto, the software, and it will implement it for you. Uh, I was very resistant with ChatGPT for a long time, and then
Hmm.
last month or so, I started to use it. And I gave like prompt, like write a few paragraphs on like a methodology section, a qualitative social science research paper. Like do 30 interviews with professional workers about AI.
Hmm.
And it spit out a text that was really good, I thought.
Hmm.
Um, or sometimes like when I do when I write a paper and I want to do the literature review, um, it's what I could just simply do is to say, like let's say if I wanted to cite um, sections within
Yeah.
um,
Richard's book.
Das Kapital, for
McDonaldization.
instance,
Oh,
right?
that's Capital. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I could say, well, what did Marx say about, technology and labor, for instance, right? And it
Hmm.
would,
Provide you a script, I guess, an outline or something.
yeah, it would give you the 5, 6 paragraph summary of
Yeah.
what he's saying about this topic. And then the thing is that all I have to do, I mean, so I don't do straight up copy paste. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Of course.
but I kind of get the main idea and then I make sure that I can incorporate it.
All right.
And sometimes, yeah, I mean, sometimes you will just do copy paste certain sections within it. So yeah, and it just saves quite a bit of time. Uh, to review
Mhm.
literature, for instance.
And it could produce references now too, right? References as far as
Yeah,
bibliography
so the
references.
free version, I think it's much tougher to do that.
Right. Right.
It's like, well, summarize me this paper, and then I give the URL to the document.
Uh,
And it doesn't do that
have,
necessarily, and
have
not
you
the
tried?
3.5
Yeah.
one.
I know there's Google Translate, but have you tried to use a ChatGPT to translate into a foreign text? And I mean, have you ever tried that? Yeah, I've heard some students have tried to use different language models. If they're trying to translate something from English into Spanish, then there's apparently a better AI is really good at that.
It's better
Yeah.
than Google
Google,
Translate.
yeah, as I was informed. There's a way to enhance it, apparently. Dialects too, apparently. Certain dialects. You can dumb it down to a certain reading level, or you could use prompts to, make it a layperson's kind of summary rather than an academic summary. That's what I've heard. So that has a lot of capabilities that were interesting, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I so one of the articles that I've seen was saying that there's a pro-English bias for
Hmm.
generative AI, which is not surprising because what is generative AI? I mean, it relies on the training data that you're able to feed it, and because the internet was an American invention, right? So basically, especially in the earlier days of the internet, and certainly all of the like programming languages were all designed for native English speakers. So, and a vast majority of the World Wide Web text is going to be in English. Because you also have to consider that, you know, like non-native English speakers that want to produce content for an international audience,
Hmm.
and they use English by default, right? So it's not surprising that the training data that we're feeding to things like ChatGPT are going to be primarily in the English language. Now, this kind of like imbalance, I mean, you could address that over time, right? So the more, um, you could say other languages that you feed into the, as a training data, then then GPT will also work better in the other languages.
That could open up opportunities for academics, international publication and getting it out of just this Western academic, you know, bubble. Vice versa. I'm assuming. I mean, if uh, let's say sociologists or anthropologists translated into different languages, German or whatever, or English or even Portuguese. That might be interesting. What effect, if any, academics can profit off of that, or they can gain an advantage. I mean, even myself, I mean, when I look at different associations, sociology, professional associations, I don't speak Portuguese, but I'm very interested in the international associations. Of course, there's an international sociology association, but there's national associations where it's hard sometimes to read the text because they're foreign. I can do well with German, but like there's some texts I can just like Spanish. I'm not fluent. I don't speak Spanish, but I would be amazed to, if sometimes if they're important sociologists, they have already published it in a variety of languages, but sometimes they're not yet big, and it's still in maybe French language. I've noticed. So what I'm saying is, I guess it may open up opportunities in the future that people
Yeah,
could
there's going to
translate.
be better globalization,
Yeah,
interconnectedness for sure.
yeah,
I was just listening to a podcast because I got a lot into like nutrition and health based research. And so there's journalist Gary Tops, and he did a lot of research into medical studies on diabetes and kind of the causes, especially the type 2 diabetes, the one that
hmm
you acquire as a result of insulin
insulin.
resistance.
Hmm.
And he figured out actually that by doing, very good archival research, that a lot of the good medical studies that were done on diabetes, uh, and by good studies, I mean we're talking randomized controlled trial studies,
Hmm.
not just correlational epidemiological studies,
Hmm.
where you just distribute food surveys to people and ask them what they ate that day.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them were actually published in German, so
Oh wow.
by German and Austrian researchers in the first 3 decades, let's say, of the 20th century, the last century. And uh, and that of course creates the barrier, right? Where if you're, let's say, an American clinician, um, and if you didn't happen to read speak German, or study in a German or Austrian university, you might not get good diabetic research, and then it could have an impact for sure on um, the ability of, let's say, American doctors and clinicians to treat patients, with that disease, right?
Mm.
And yeah, so 100 years ago, right, when those studies were done, yeah, this was a really big issue. Um, well, today, I mean, it wouldn't be an issue primarily because there's a lot of funding on medical research in America.
Right.
Some of it somewhat biased, but there's still a lot of money in it. Um,
Mm.
uh, but of course, we could be using the translational tools to basically share all the knowledge in the world. Um, and plus, I think nowadays, I think because a lot of the European scientists, I think they're recognizing the power of English, and so um,
Yeah.
and so
Opening up.
they all publish in English, in English journals, even in the European countries. Um, uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
so
that's amazing. Yeah. Look forward to it.
yeah,
Mhm.
so that's actually, I mean, that could be one of the good things. I mean, but then of course, there's always the risk, right? The risk of these new technologies.
Mm.
Um, specifically like, how much labor demand, is there going to be, right? I mean, um, in a way, I mean, if we're telling our young people that we want to advance the knowledge economy. Right? That is the kind of it's kind of the latest iteration of the neoliberal discourse, right? Um,
Mhm.
which is we are creating the so-called knowledge economy, where people are kind of increasingly merging with artificial intelligence, and thereby keep themselves relevant within this global economy.
Yeah.
Um,
Hyper competitive, yeah. Very hyper competitive. But maybe briefly, just for their listeners too, no knowledge economy and how do you relate that to the information society, or uh, is it similar to Manuel Castell's idea of the network society, or I mean, there's a lot of buzzwords that people use. Let's say knowledge society or information age or all sorts of nice. What is more appealing to you? I mean, what label would you use? This you're using that an information dominant society, or you think we're I'm trying to figure out what uh, entry point you're using there. When you say knowledge society, just academic sector or the entire information
yeah, so
publishing and everything.
so for me, it's everything is in the context of capital, right?
Okay.
It's always about capital accumulation, and it's just the most recent iteration, the most recent technology that is used in order to bring about capital accumulation. So it's kind of like, think of like, you know,
Mhm.
different costumes, but the core product is kind of still the same thing, right? It's about, can you extract more value, measured economic value, um, you know, from this new technology,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that's kind of where we're at. I mean, so there's this article by Eric Brynjolfsson, who's one of the leading economists in the field of new technologies,
Mhm.
and he kind of talks about this idea of delayed productivity growth, right? So
Mhm.
because there was an objection that AI research is not producing a lot of net economic benefits. There's this argument by Robert Gordon. He's one of the big pessimists
Of globalization.
regarding
Yeah.
economic growth, regarding
Okay.
productivity growth. Um, he kind of keeps saying that, well, if the robots are there, where are they, right? He doesn't see them, and so on and so forth. And Brynjolfsson's counterpoint is um, that the technology is there, it's already in effect, but it takes time to diffuse across the economy. So if you
Mhm.
take into account the the timing delay of the fusion of new technologies, then it is actually only a matter of time um, until it starts to take over and starts to dominate more and more parts of the economy.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, on your original idea of like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
knowledge economy versus the network
Yeah,
society.
information. Yeah,
Um,
I hear those terms a lot. Go ahead, go ahead. I hear those terms and they're thrown around. So I'm curious which one you're. Uh, you know, I'm kind of I'm kind of more of a Manuel Castell kind of thinker, but but there's different. Everybody has different terms for information based. Information society and um the the new global public sphere, or like is it just the communication itself, or is it a communication of a aspect, is it global communication.
well, again, for me,
Yeah.
it's not about communication per se. It's not
Okay.
about processing. information via, neural networks and AI and so on and so forth. I mean, for me, these are all the instruments. But in the final analysis, I think that the question of the tools matters much less than the goal, right? So
Got
what
it.
is it used for?
Got it.
And so again, the goal is capital accumulation and
Yeah. 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 Makes sense. Okay.
economic value extraction. And eh, and that's what and I think that's what gets us into a crisis. So I just saw this graph a couple of days ago, which was about, I think it was published in the Atlantic magazine. It was about the frequency at which young people, teenagers, are meeting their friends in real life. So when we're not talking about, FaceTiming and stuff. So
It's
really,
decline. Yeah.
yeah, like
Uh,
really face to face actually. So
yeah.
so we went from um like I think the survey question was like meeting your friends at least twice a week, right, face to
Yeah.
face. And that percentage declined from over 90%
Yeah.
of our teenagers down to about 60%.
Yeah.
And that is a very precipitous drop. Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
and
Go ahead. Well, I was going to enter, but you know what? It kind of echoes predictions made by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, and as far back as the 60s, David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd. So maybe we're just now seeing it happened with this generation, but those topics were always, I guess, a concern even decades ago of Putman's thesis, social capital in decline, nobody's bullying anymore. I guess we can really see it with technology and capability of technology to replace the need for actual human physical connection. But the I guess the theories go back, I mean, all the way to David Reisman, The Lonely Crowd. I think he wrote that in the 60s. Putman, I think, was 90s.
2000s, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, it's an old thesis, but I think it now we can really see it.
Yeah, and I would say, well, I
Yeah,
mean, I would really start
yeah,
uh,
maybe
the
further back.
that literature with Durkheim, probably, right?
Okay, okay, okay.
I
Organic
would really go
solidarity.
back as far as that, yeah.
Enemy. That
Yeah,
far back with suicide.
enemy, suicide, I mean,
Okay,
basically
okay.
explaining, poor mental health based on
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sociological factors, specifically
Okay,
isolation, individualization, like brought about by division of labor, new technologies, and industrialization, and urbanization, right?
right.
So and that theorem, I think, is definitely true.
Mm,
That And like, okay, so if you take the Durkheim thesis and the Putnam thesis, which is really saying the same thing,
right.
just in different time periods and with different technologies in place, is that I do think that social media is different qualitatively, right? Because by mimicking a connection, right? Because you are able to text with people, and in this way you are connected in some way with other people. It's just that the it is not in its full form, right? It is not in a form that is like in nutrition research, there's this term bioavailable, right?
Mm,
Like where like if you eat something that has the bioavailable nutrients, it means that your body can absorb most of those nutrients and use that to for cell functions. Um, and not like all food items have a high degree of bioavailability. Um, which means that even if the nutrients were in the food, it wouldn't be absorbed. So and the same thing with like social connections, right? If you wanted to have the maximum, you could say bioavailability of the social connections, there is no shortcut, right? I mean, you cannot
mm,
go to make texting and social media comments equivalent to the face-to-face interactions that we have been doing since the beginning of time. I mean, since the beginning of the species, right?
Mm. Do you
Um,
think, not to interrupt you, do you think this explains also the rise of singles and uh, a kind of, I don't know how you say it, yeah, the family is just shrinking too? I mean, is that related to this impact of technology, and or that we're in this late stage of post-industrial economy that's just the fertility rates are going to drop naturally? It's already kind of a cycle thing. Or you think you blame technology for that? I mean, this whole uh, excess technology that we have now, like, communication, internet, and all that.
that's
So
right.
something
Yeah, yeah.
structural, something more structural rather than just pointing it towards internet, or something structural happening rather than just the blaming it, I guess, on iPhones.
Well,
With
I
like,
mean, that's in fact, I mean, the kind of
yeah.
argument that I'm
Okay.
pursuing right now. I
Okay,
mean, I
okay,
mean,
good, good, good.
it's
Yeah.
about social media, it's about technology, and I
Right.
mean, so technology is a very broad term,
Right.
because you could make the argument that, well, when we introduced the telephone, well, that was, 100 years ago, it was a new form of technology. Um, and it was a new communication tool where, you could speak to people that were living far away from where you were.
Mm,
Um, but it doesn't necessarily diminish the amount of your communication and contact with others, right? Because like the statistic from the Atlantic magazine, right, where it's you kept at about more than 90%, right, of face-to-face regular face-to-face interactions. Because I mean, like, let's say if you were calling up your friend that was living down the street to say, hey, let's meet at 3 p.m. On Saturday, right,
mm,
at this place. So it was still about, I mean, the face to face was still not being displaced. But in the social media world, where if the young people are saying, well, I feel very uncomfortable if people are speaking to me face to face, while I feel very comfortable if they text me, right? I think that is a very different kind of
mm.
social expectation. Um,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
yeah, and so I mean, and when you make the link to fertility, I think it's very, very concerning, right? That
Yeah.
um, I mean, ultimately, the existence of our species is absolutely based on reproduction, right? So our ability
Mm,
to carry our genes to the next generation, and I mean, even ourselves, right? I mean, we don't have children, right? And
hmm
so so this is, I think, the single biggest transformation that we are observing, um, and it
Right.
is threatening to the species, absolutely. If you just count fewer and fewer heads over time, right?
Mm.
Um,
One follow-up. I don't know if you ever heard of the book by Eva Illouz, 1997. She published the book Consuming the Romantic Utopia, uh, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. I think it was a qualitative study. She interviewed couples and, preferences for dating, stuff like that. But I try to remember her underlying kind of thesis is that when it comes to romance and love and intimacy, that those have been kind of hijacked by the market and turned romance per se as a product form. And and I wonder if that explains to some extent even things like these dating websites and plenty of fish, for instance, or these products we associate with romance, or even Valentine's Day, which was just a couple of days ago. But everything that's product related that pushes the product, right? But actually, there's really no intimacy. I mean, there's no. people getting married and stuff like that. It's more or less consuming the product. We're consuming this romantic utopia that's created in markets, within a market context, dating itself. And she kind of pulls this out of interviews that, yeah, there's preferences for people to date at a certain, restaurant, and they have certain expectations, but it's about eating, going out and consuming. It's not really about uh, intimate relations, or very little, very little. What do you think about that? You think it's also to some extent, this commercialized culture that's sort of tricking people into misleading or misleading patterns that they think they're engaging in some kind of intimate behavior when they buy their date, a box of chocolate or a diamond ring? Is that there's something there, or you think that's going too far? If you
Well,
listen,
I mean,
yeah,
having the date, I mean, that doesn't sound, what causes the issues. I mean, I think,
yeah,
it is about the way, um, how the dates come about,
okay,
and the cultural expectations
right,
for dating, right? So,
yeah,
so if you go back to the beginning of times, I would say that arranged marriages, right, was kind
hmm
of the most common form of relationship formation, right, where you have basically two families that were agreeing to marry off their offspring, right? You'd have, the parents who would be deciding for the kids whom they should marry. And those were kind of enforced, you know, marriages, right, where
hmm
romantic love was not at the center, but those tended to be the most stable relationships. Um, because again, because the cultural expectation
hmm
was that you had to reproduce, you had
hmm
to you know take care of aging parents and so forth, and the properties of the two families that get married together. Um, and then you have this idea of romantic love, which is really, I suppose you could call it a Western invention, right? It
hmm
comes with individualized culture. It comes with like moving out of your parents' house, which means that you are removing yourself from the clutches, the economic and the social clutches of your parents. Um, that and that created much higher levels of expectations, and so this was the beginning of seeing not just marriages but also divorces, right?
hmm
Because now you don't have the power of the parents to kind of block
hmm
the divorce, and also because there was so high expectations, right? Because in romantic love, I mean, it's really like it's really about having this expressive feeling for the
hmm
other person, and if you say
yeah,
that the expressive feeling is gone, well, then the relationship is gone too. But that was still okay. I think this is still a relatively stable arrangement,
right, right,
because a lot of those romantic relationships they come about through um, what you might call dense social networks, right? So basically, you marry your high school sweetheart, right? Or like a
hmm
college sweetheart. You stayed in the same dormitory, right? Things like that. Or you were introduced by a common friend. So it used to be, I mean, up until the internet era, I mean, the most common way to meet a romantic partner was usually a mutual friend introduction,
hmm
right?
or in proximity to where you live, right,
Yeah, be
right,
like, or yeah, locational, right?
yeah,
Locational, or like, schooling or work, right? So it would have to be some kind of common
mm.
membership. Uh,
Endogamy, yeah,
yeah, well, a common membership in an organization usually, right? Like a
hmm
school or a workplace, right?
okay,
So that was the most common way. And those were still okay relationships, right? Because it doesn't disrupt, you could say the social and ultimately the biological reproduction, right? Now, now comes the latest phase,
hmm
which is the social media era, um, or the app era, right? Where you're saying, okay, well, I meet my date through
funny,
Tinder.
Plenty of
um,
fish, right? Or something.
yeah, or Bumble or any of these
Yeah.
apps, and a lot of relationships have come into being in this way. But you notice that the expectations are completely different because by removing the constraint on the choice, you change the expectations fundamentally.
Hmm.
Where the person that agrees to go on a date with you cannot enjoy the moment of the date, but rather has to think about being able to reject the suitor,
Hmm.
go back to the app, and find somebody who is even better.
Yeah. So like a social Darwinistic kind of thinking, like you can reject more, you could select those that you find really, really appealing and then reject 95% of of the context, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
like so almost like an unrealistic there's expectations and then there's the gap that grows, like
Right.
would that go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, finish it. I
Yeah.
was think
Yeah. Go ahead. You.
I was thinking that that may explain this whole phenomenon of people changing their pictures or their wanting to present themselves in a really superficial way, or even deception when it comes to income or success, or that it's uh, unrealistic expectations that maybe people bring to these websites. And of course, a lot of the websites also, I mean, they give premium memberships that cost more, they give more benefits. You can do more on the website, for instance, or you can do less. There's all sorts of websites that cater to certain groups, Christian or even political affiliation. There's religious based. So some of these are really becoming very selective, but also really, again, going towards particular taste or lifestyle. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I kind of see. I don't know. Go ahead if you have anything to add.
Yeah. And we're kind of being told that, having more choice, like over customization, right, is good for us, right? So you can, focus on, I don't know, a particular race, right? You could focus on, yeah, a particular religion of the partner,
Mhm.
or a particular hobby, right? And so on. And there's like, infinite number of ways in which customization of a romantic partner can happen. Um,
Mhm.
but uh, but ultimately, it's uh, so
Mhm.
you know having too much choice is bad for us. I mean, so that goes back to this Herbert Simon literature and satisficing and bounded rationality, right?
Mhm.
Where effectively, um, we are rational only with respect to having limited choices where we can sort of ponder and deliberate over it. um if we have too many of the choices, then we start not to go wisely anymore. And there is an absolute decision fatigue. um
Mhm.
and Yeah, and again, it's about the cultural expectations that completely shift, and it goes a- and the end outcome is that, yeah, that there is no interest to settle down, basically. I mean, well, there is, let me rephrase it. I mean, I think there's a biological desire to settle down, to
Mhm.
get married, have children, etc., and many people still do that. um but the expected outcome, really, of the current dating culture is based on the social media and the commodification, as Lewis pointed out, um,
Maybe even
is,
McDonaldization, perhaps.
yeah, this McDonaldization, the rationalization, right, where you can
Yeah.
fill out your dating profile, you can curate the images that you put there, and
Yeah.
also the information about yourself, right?
Don't forget AI.
Yeah,
It's all in there now.
and yeah, so and this is I mean,
Uh,
it ultimately, I think, I mean, the outcome of it, the social outcome of it is terrible, right? So
mhm,
it is about, reducing the number of people that would choose to settle down, right? And then, but then the confusing thing, I mean, goes back to this, Weberian iron cage argument is that, well, I
mhm,
mean, would you actually be able to, return to an older era of, basically relationship formation? Um, the answer kind of is yes. I mean, but you'd have to consciously choose that path, and you'd have to find people that, within that tribe that would, uh, that would, philosophically agree with your standpoint, right?
mhm,
Um,
yeah,
and yeah, so and I think so, and that's why, the internet era. I mean, it does have advantages too, right? I think that, you can, find yourself a community and, you know
mhm,
um a so-called safe space, right?
mhm,
Those have become possible, because of the internet era. Okay, so,
yeah, good topic.
the next thing I wanted to discuss was, yeah, so the Lance Brecht podcast. So we had,
Mhm,
they were discussing this interview, right, between, Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. And it's kind of, this never-ending saga, effectively, because, so much attention is being absorbed, by the war in Ukraine.
mhm,
And so before the podcast, I read about half of the interview, just the transcript. I didn't listen to it,
mhm,
of that Carlson Putin interview. And well,
yeah,
I mean, well, it's quite tragic in some sense because, well, I mean, Carlson was not, like, a good interviewer at all, right? I mean, he was just,
mhm,
um, you know, kind of being really supportive of the Putin talking points, right? I mean, it
yeah,
wasn't like critical
very
journalism.
coziness, very close coziness.
Um,
That was some of
yeah,
the critique.
yeah,
Mhm,
and then Putin's discourse himself, right? I mean, he kind of says that, he really starts off with history, right? So, going really back, several hundreds of years, where he basically argues that the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and the Austrian Empire, that each held, chunks of territory of Western Ukraine, today's Western Ukraine, including the Ukrainian population in those regions. Um, that really, it is those external powers that are evil, because
not,
they're the ones
not him. Yeah.
that are stealing the Ukrainian people from Mother Russia, right?
Mhm.
The Russians are the good people, right?
Victims.
Yeah, that's right. And then so that's how he starts off with, and then he says some, like, very absurd, like, historical revisionism, right, where he basically argues that, the Poles have to blame themselves for
Mm.
being invaded by Hitler, right?
So blaming the victims now too. Wow.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, if they had just given up the Danzig corridor, if you remember that, northern piece,
Mhm,
of what used to be part of the German Empire, but then it was, given to Poland, after World War One. And yeah, the Poles, they just shot themselves in the foot, right? And I mean, and even with that kind of discourse, I mean, you're kind of clearly seeing, I mean, that Putin has absolutely no respect,
mm.
for the other European countries, right? It's only, I mean, the legitimate security, uh, national sovereignty, territorial interests. The only justifiable one is the Russian one, right?
Mm.
Um, and then of course, the discourse from the 1990s onward, where he kind of says that he offered to President Clinton, in the late 90s. So, right when he stepped into office, I think around the year 99, 2000, and he said, "Can we join as the Russian Federation into NATO?"
Mm,
And at that time, it was being rejected. That offer was rejected by the Americans.
mm,
Um, Now, it's a big question. I mean, was this a fundamental standpoint, right, where they were saying, "Well, we never want the Russians to be part of the organization," or was it about, well, let's just do one step at a time, right?
mm,
And maybe eventually, after many years, it will
yeah.
be possible. And then the other thing, I mean, he was starting to attack the Bush administration for setting up the nuclear defense shields, not, the Patriot missile system in Poland and the Czech Republic, which he thought was to be kind of an attack on Russia.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, definitely.
and then ultimately, and then he justifies the Ukraine invasion by saying that there was a democratically elected government under Viktor Yanukovych, and the West was contributing to the coup attempt
Mm,
against Yanukovych. Um, and so
mm,
so
yeah.
even if we conceded that point, right? So let's say, I mean, let's assume that the CIA was kind of behind this Maidan thing. I mean,
Mm,
I don't think this would be enough.
yeah.
This would be enough to change that government. I think that so Yanukovych, I mean, he created these expectations, knowing that this is where the majority sentiment was in Ukraine. They were saying we want to sign an EU association agreement, right? Basically to
Mm,
improve trade relations between the EU and Ukraine. And he had campaigned on that issue back, I think, in 2010 when he was running for the election. Um, he was about to sign that agreement with the EU, and then Putin was kind of saying, "No, no, 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 we don't want that to happen. So you're
mm,
instead going to sign an agreement with Russia, right? You're going to stay within the Russian orbit."
yeah.
And so, really, I
Wow.
mean, I think you know, I mean, I think the issue, I think, at this point of the conflict, I think it is pretty clear, right? I mean,
Mm,
you have an imperialist power,
mm-hmm.
and they're saying, well, we want you to be part of our empire. And you have the smaller country that says, no, 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 we want to be an independent country.
Using
Uh,
force, yeah. Military force, yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and at this point, I mean, there is no peaceful way to resolve this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I I always thought that uh, when I, listen to Putin and I analyze what he's doing, it's a dictator's trick book. So I mean, if you think of the 20th century and of all the previous dictators in history, especially extrajudicial killings and people disappearing and the way, Putin does the descendants and how opposition leaders are killed. And it's an old dictator's tool book or trick book. And we have seen these before. I mean, Milosevic, Serbia, I mean, all over the world, you can pick the 20th century, I mean, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, you know, uh, in Latin America, Pinochet, Tito, Yugoslavia. So all these names we've heard of before, but I wonder if we looked at it as a historical phenomenon when, these people rise, the agency that they carry out, which is often horrible. I would describe it as a kind of Machiavellian view and power and just do what you must to stay in power. And that reflects when I see Putin. I really think he's 20th century dictator that wants to play Stalin. He wants to present himself as a big guy, and you can see this. I mean, in his speeches, his cynicism. There was, I think today, they had uh, the death of the opposition leader that died in the prison, Alexei, what's he?
Navalny.
Navalny. Yeah, he was smirking. He was just like laughing. It's like that's a cynicism that is often, visible in dictators that have a real lack of empathy, you know. So that's how I would interpret it. I would think of it as a historical phenomenon where it's a dictator's trick, or playbook, whatever you want to call it, and really straightforward authoritarianism, and you can see it. So that represents the policy and his strategies, and everything else is propaganda. I mean, I know it's ruthless to make it, but I would really focus on the style of his, how he does things, and it's an old dictator's trick. I mean, it's just, you know, uh, that if you look at 20th century at least, because we can select different historical figures throughout history that had similar, right, patterns or views of humans, I guess. So
Yeah, so
yeah, that's my view on it. Yeah.
yeah, so
Go
his
ahead.
belief of
Yeah.
how would you stay in power?
Mm,
I think that yes, he thinks that he can stay in power if he fights the war, right?
mhm,
He believes that if the war was stopped for any reason, that the legitimacy, the support that he would have within his regime is going to drop down. And yeah, it's a really Darwinian kind of logic where effectively, either you are the killer, right? You are the one that kills the opposition figures,
mhm,
um, and attacks neighboring countries, or you're the one that is being killed, right?
mhm, mhm.
And that's why authoritarian leaders they would be described as the strong man, but
Yeah.
then the flip side of it is that well, if for whatever reason they were perceived to be the weak man, I mean it's kind of like what we would expect to be statesmen to do, right? That that kind of believe that that peace is an important precondition for stable rule. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so yeah, like he fears that he would be eventually toppled if he was going away from the
Power.
logic of war.
Would you could you see him as being the type that would rather commit suicide than admit defeat? Could you see him? Well, I mean, predictive, or hypothetical scenario, but like that he would be the type that he knows that it would internally collapse, and that it would be a suicidal kind of ending, assuming that we can predict hypotheticals, but or it's just he will voluntarily allow another one to take his place. I don't know if that would happen.
Yeah, so
Uh, uh,
I saw snippets of the Zelensky speech at the
right.
Munich Security Conference that's
Yes.
happening right now.
Yeah.
Um, and he basically thinks that there's two ways, for Putin's rule to end. I mean, the first is that he was going to be extradited to The Hague
Mm.
for to the International
War
Criminal
crimes.
Court.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, if he ever were to be extradited to that place, which we don't know whether it will happen, presumably if there was a new leadership that came into power in Russia,
Mm.
um, that would be one way for him to end, and the other would be uh, that there would be an assassination effectively. I mean, so
Mm.
from somebody within the ranks of
Uh,
the Russian administration, who right now, I mean, they're all expressly loyalist to its Putin. But look, in authoritarian countries, I mean, you never really know because the
yeah.
people that work in the bureaucracy and the apparatus,
The loyalists. Yeah.
well, they have to you have to keep your head low. Um, because if you look up, I mean,
Yeah.
your head could be chopped off, right?
Yeah.
So you're gonna keep the cards very close to your chest for as long as possible, and it's only if you discover any form of weakness within the top leadership that you would try to take advantage of that and go in and topple the leader.
Hmm.
Um, you know, so we might still be somewhat far away from it.
Yeah.
The social media message that I saw yesterday was quite depressing to read. Actually, it was the argument that because because Putin had not received too much pushback in the past, he every action that he's undertaking becomes more and more escalatory, um, and yeah,
More
and it
violent?
becomes more and more, yeah, right, more unhinged. So if
Hmm.
you take even his treatment of Navalny, right? So, um,
Yeah.
he was the first time imprisoned in 2011, right? So,
Hmm.
and because
Put
there
him in
were
a
big,
Serbian camp, prison camp, I believe. Yeah.
yeah, so there was, yeah, he was in prison because there were mass demonstrations against Putin's run for the election in 2012. Um, but at that point, I mean, the poisoning happened much later. I think it was a couple of years after that. I think in 2018, 19 or so. Um, But up until that point, I mean, he was kind of, well, okay, go to jail, and then he would be let out, and then he would run for an office. And then, of course, the vote would be rigged against
Hmm.
Navalny. But then he would keep trying. Yeah, right. So it was a little bit of a cat and mouse game until at the point where he decided to do the poisoning. Putin decided to poison him.
Hmm.
Then, of course, he went to Germany for the treatment,
Yeah.
right?
Recovery. Yeah.
And then when he was released,
They jailed him,
when
right?
he went back, then was put on trial, and then he was not let out of the prison.
19 years, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sentence.
And then right now, because you have the Russian election season, so now he's being killed. And so, in a way, I mean, even like a couple years ago, I think Putin was quite concerned. It's like, well, if I kill Navalny, it's going to be, you know, he's too popular, right? I mean, it's going to
Yeah.
create a mass uprising. And now I think it's gotten to the point where he believes that the opposition in Russia is so neutered, right? The highly educated people, they've already left the country. And many of them at the beginning of the war, they went to Turkey, they went, to Dubai, right? They just left Russia.
Hmm.
And so there isn't really a strong
Opposition, huh?
democratic, liberal minded opposition, right? The ones that would threaten his power. Uh, and so right now, I mean, it's very hard to tell. I mean, it's only one day onward. I mean, there were some public gatherings in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Um, then Putin sent in the police forces and imprisoned those protesters. Um,
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
is it going to be enough pressure for the regime change? I mean, perhaps not right now.
Yeah.
I think it might
Yeah.
be a little bit too early.
Mm.
I do think that
Y-
there is a potential for the Putin regime to violently
Yeah.
end,
Do you remember
but not now.
the Pussycat riots? These were feminist groups that whatever happened to them in the I know they were also shut down by they were also imprisoned. The Pussycat riots.
Yeah.
You remember the women that would kind of do nude protests? And I guess those also got shut down by the regime. But that's one memory I have. There were a series of intellectuals, of course, some that would then have to flee and exile places like Germany or U.S. as exiled scholars and intellectuals. But I know there were still some movements like the Pussycat Riot that happened. If I'm not mistaken, I hope it's the same movement, but it was like feminist movement. in Russia.
Yeah, I know what you're
Yeah,
referring to. I mean,
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't follow up with what
yeah,
happened to them.
yeah.
So
This so it's so I follow it. I follow it, but yeah, definitely concerning. I just want to mention one more thing. I mean, I really think this legacy of 20th century dictators, this ghost seems to still be visible in Putin. You know, the whole strategy and style of his politics. I mean, it resembles, like I said, identical Stalin. I mean, or Mussolini, or whoever you want to pick. You know, I mean, the tactics and all that. So that's ironic. We're in the 21st century, and we still have this ghost of dictators from the 20th century that we still see now. Crazy. We would think we would. Remember they used to say the end of history. And well, Fukuyama, what was his name? No, not Fukuyama.
Francis Fukuyama, yeah.
Yeah, that was big in the 90s and too. Everybody was doing this end of history and liberal democracy won, and now it's like, wow, we're back in the 20th century again. Pretty much. Yeah,
Yeah, I
we're
mean, well, I mean, if we wanted to go back to the,
Mhm.
the status game argument,
Yeah,
where it seems like, you know, there is a biological program in humans, right? Which includes the desire for status,
yeah.
the use of competition to prevail against our opponents, right?
Mhm.
And at a country level, um, while the stakes are just much higher, right? I mean, I mean, let's say, I mean, if you are at a sports competition, right, where I try to run faster than you, right? I mean, there's not much at stake, right? Because it's just our own honor and our own reputation, right?
Mhm.
The problem with presidents and leaders of countries is that there's a lot at stake, right? Because it's about your country's citizens access to territory and resources and well-being, you could say, in an economic sense. Um, and in that kind of status game, I mean, there apparently seems to be two kinds of status games, right? So you could have the capitalistic status game, right, which is what most countries in the world are pursuing, right, which is basically to have more GDP, income, and population growth than the countries next to you, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then you have the imperialistic status game,
Mm.
right, where it's basically
Power
you have
play, huh?
yeah you have to control the biggest military and the largest amount of territory, including colonial possessions that you have under your wing. And it is true that the United States
Mhm.
is good at playing both games, to be quite frank. So, we have the biggest uh, economy in the world, GDP. We do quite well regarding the population because not because of fertility, but because of immigration. Ultimately, I mean, we talk about the border crisis down south. Um, you know, it is we're still able to attract lots of talent from overseas, right?
Mhm.
But then also in terms of this imperialistic game, I think the U.S. also does, um, you know, a good job. And by good job, I mean I don't mean it normatively. I mean I'm just meaning
Well,
that
just a
they're able,
superpower. You could just say superpower,
right? Where basically,
Yeah.
within the NATO alliance,
Mhm.
and I mean not just NATO. I mean I would call it NATO plus, right? So
Uh,
I mean, if you take non-NATO members like Japan, Australia, Singapore, right? There's a bunch of countries that you can put them in NATO plus, which means the U.S. based, U.S. led military alliance system,
mhm.
um, where the U.S. again does very very well in this kind of imperialistic status game. Um, and then you have a former superpower, which is Russia, right? By being at the center of it through the Soviet Union when it was there,
Mhm.
um, they felt like, well, we are the co-equals with the United States. And I mean, interesting, even Putin in the interview himself, he admitted, look, the, the global competition is between US and China. These are the two big powers. It's not the Russians that should be considered to be the geopolitical threat for the West. Now, of course, that's a very self-serving way of putting it because obviously he's
Mhm.
invading Ukraine and he's definitely a threat to
Yeah.
the West. Um, but yeah, I mean, in Putin's mind, effectively, I mean, you have inferiority complex. That's really what it boils down to, right? It's like,
You you think that explains this deep ethnocentrism of you mean inferiority complex? He thinks other countries are inferior? Is that what you mean? Or do you mean
well,
that
no, he thinks that
or he's
Russia is inferior to the United
uh
States.
okay.
Um,
Uh I always thought of the rhetoric sounds like Russian nationalism or Russian, make Russia great again or something. I don't know. I mean, that's maybe I misinterpret the language of Putin, but it seemed like he was had this wants to make Russia a great and imperialistic power again. He sees it from a like going back to the Tsar days, I guess. Unless I misinterpret. I always thought it was kind of ethnocentrism. Very much a uh,
well, I mean, the
yeah,
assertion of ethno-nationalism,
There you go. That's the word. Ethno.
I mean, it is based off of that inferiority complex, right? So, I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
it's by feeling you're inferior that you have to assert that national identity, right?
Yeah.
Um,
The reason why I bring that up, a couple of months ago, Marcus Lanz, he had a few commentators that really brought up this thesis again of the imagined community and, this whole language propaganda that's used even to use propaganda, as far as recruiting Russian soldiers and telling them what they're really fighting for and why they're doing this, what they're doing in Ukraine. And so it's very much driven by this deep nationalism. And that's what makes it interesting from that standpoint. I mean, it is heavy language. It is deeply propaganda. I mean, the way the communication is controlled, right? And you only have one perspective, I guess, in Russia, and it's Russian state TV. It's Russian control of information and almost having the view that they have the monopoly of truth. And so yeah, so
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
that's
So
part.
yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, so you
Yeah,
described an authoritarian system.
yeah.
And the important thing for me is that
Mm,
that the Russians, I mean, they feel inferior. They're not able to use what you might call soft power, right?
mm,
I mean, soft power. I mean, it's really about you know ideological levers that you have in order to bring the countries to your side, right? And the US has a significant amount of soft power.
mhm.
Um, and
It's symbolic too, right? I guess.
yeah, I mean,
It's
so because I mean, ultimately, I mean, so it does go back to this, um, this Protestant ethic kind of, right?
mm,
It's this kind of like manifest destiny,
mhm,
kind of like America is like the leading missionary, not necessarily for nowadays for Christian ideology, but rather for liberal democracy. Kind of those are the secularized
mhm,
versions of this like Christian philosophy.
mhm,
And the U.S. is able to attract. the countries, specifically uh, the Central Eastern European countries. Because I mean, if you go to like a place like France,
Poland.
for instance,
Okay.
well, I mean, the French, they always are skeptical about like Anglo-American kind of systems. Um, the Germans, they're kind of like, well, because they lost the World War II, so they kind of subservient to the Anglo-based model. But yeah, as you mentioned, Poland,
Hmm.
the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, for them, it's not so much that they love waving the American flag, but rather they think that it is the ticket that they have to punch
Hmm.
in order to free themselves from the Russian oppression,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That they have experienced over, I guess, basically hundreds of years of continental European conflict, right? And
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, the U.S., I mean, is
Mm.
in that sense, I mean, it is an imperial power, but it is not oppressive in the way that the Russian Empire would be, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, you see this everywhere. I mean, it's like you have like these pro-Western demonstrations that were happening in Georgia, right, in the Caucasus country, in Moldova, right, where you had the pro-Western government put in charge, in Belarus, where basically Putin saved Lukashenko's presidency, right,
Mhm.
because he clearly rigged that election, right, in Ukraine, right, where the pro-Russian government was toppled in 2014. So there is no soft power that Russia has is not able to develop one,
Mhm.
right? Because it's kind of like you know this idea of um liberal democracy it does not make sense to Putin, does not make sense to most of the conservative political forces in Russia.
Russia.
I mean,
Mhm.
they sort of believe in as there's this argument by a Russian philosopher, Ilyin is this guy's name, I think Ivan Ilyin, and he says that you know um, that the essential Russian feature is what he called backwardness, right?
Mhm.
Um, and by backwardness, I mean kind of like it's a strong normative assumption. I mean, another word would be feudalism, right?
Mhm.
So it would be a social order where the rule of the Tsar in terms of politics is absolute,
Mhm.
where um, the economic system is based on um, basically countryside, right? So farming,
Yeah.
uh, and where and then of course and then you have a strong army, right? Because you have to defend against foreign invaders. So yeah, I mean it's a yeah, I mean a fully feudalist economy, right? You
Most
know,
part, yeah.
um,
Mm.
and and that's kind of the ideal. Now, I mean, the interesting thing is that when Putin tries to defend this kind of you know society of backwardness, so to speak, um, against the West, he then uses these culture issues, the culture wedge issues that we are having here in the West,
Yeah, this whole anti,
like gay marriage and stuff
yeah,
like that.
the gender studies, I think, were also
Gender
banned, or
studies, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
feminists, everything. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he kind of frames the discourse around the culture war issues
Mm.
in America, where he's trying to appeal to the social conservatives in America, right?
Yeah. Which raises another question. The state of sociology in Russia today, is it totally state servant, or are they just totally abolished? Do you have any I mean, do you know anything about it? I read a little bit. I have some information that apparently there have been some sociologists that lost their jobs and they were either threatened to be fired or they were sacked or but the state of sociology and social science generally in Russia is very interesting to me because uh, what exactly is Putin doing and how is this transforming the intellectual class there? And obviously, there's been a big brain drain and people just fleeing, since the war. But uh, it'd be interesting to do a little research, find out what exactly is the state of social science and universities there if they are just being forced to go the line, what uh, Putin wants, or they still have some autonomy and some degree of, but it doesn't seem like it from my readings, I guess. Especially
Yeah,
because all the networks and the journalists even can't, do any independent reporting.
well, so there was this one
Yeah.
research fellow
Yeah.
at Princeton when I was
Okay.
still there.
Hmm.
So when the war started, his name is Greg Uden, and he was one of those sociologists at one of the major universities in Moscow, and he was one of the early scholar refugees, I
Oh
suppose.
wow. Oh
It
yeah.
was then accommodated through a fellowship at Princeton.
Hmm.
And I'm sure this is happening all over the place where the leading social scientists are fleeing that country. I did see, I think in the Spiegel, they did make an interview with the head of Lebedev Center, which is the kind of social science polling agency.
Oh yeah, I read about that.
Uh, well, but they have to report in very restricted manner because all of the funding comes from the state,
Yeah.
right? The state commissions those opinion polls, and so they have to be very guarded, and they are not able to express kind of their views regarding this conflict, the war.
Yeah.
Um, there was an interview with one of my mentors, Alejandro Portes. It was around the time when he was the ASA president in the late 90s. And he was commenting about the state of like kind of like Latin American sociology and also the kind of ups and downs of that field. And his major argument was kind of that in order for sociology to flourish, I mean, you need a liberal democratic society, right? So basically, I mean, it comes in a unified package, so to speak, right? So all of the elements that you would want to see in effect in a liberal democracy, they have to be there in order for a field like sociology to flourish. So
Yeah.
you need to have an independent media, you need
Hmm.
to have an independent judiciary, you need to have independent universities, right? Um, you
And
know,
an open public sphere, I guess. So open sphere as far as you can talk and you can speak, and there's no repression against speech rights, and what you
that's right.
publish can't
That's right.
kill you. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
that's
when
right. You need to have the maximum out of the public sphere. Now, I mean, when I was listening to his podcast with Bobby Kennedy, who's running for president now on
uh,
an independent party ticket, and actually the accusation that he's making against against the U.S. system is that that the free speech platforms themselves are being undermined, and he thinks that that Elon Musk's Twitter is basically the only institution that would give him the platform. And then the interesting thing is that you know I think in part because you know Kennedy is able to retain the platform via Twitter. He said that Facebook gave him back his account that had been suspended for a while. Um, and because ultimately like if it's like so so if the government, let's say, if they wanted to censor a particular message, right, and if they're able to censor all of the platforms at the same time,
Mm,
right, uniformly, um then what they're doing is successful. Now the problem is, for the from the censor's perspective, is that if you only are able to control some of the platforms, but then some platforms are still retaining that free speech element, it's going to put significant pressure over time on the platforms that are still complying with the censoring, right?
yeah,
And so then it will push more to the free speech platform. Now, I mean, whether people agree with Kennedy's views or not, I mean, I think that's less important. I think but the principle, I think that
hmm,
that speech should be unlimited, in some sense. I mean, unless there is a risk, uh, like threats against
right,
individuals.
right.
I mean,
Uh,
that's criminal.
livelihood, and yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that's right. Yeah, so libels and
Uh,
stuff like that. I mean,
uh,
that's still covered
yeah,
under civil and sometimes criminal law.
uh,
But other than that, I mean, expressing viewpoints, I think, um, that should be covered under the free speech. Uh, and Yeah, but in any case, I mean, but again, but even on that basis, I mean, clearly, I mean, the U.S. and the Russian system is not comparable. I mean,
oh no, no, not at all.
um, I
No
mean,
attempt, no attempt to try to make those comparisons.
yeah, I mean, so I mean, over here, I mean, we
It's
can crap.
different. There's different kind of anti-intellectualism. We have to, yeah, definitely differentiate between those two.
Yeah, so I mean, like we can
Uh,
spend 3 hours here and we can crap on Biden,
yeah,
or we
yeah,
can crap on Trump, and it'll be
yeah,
perfectly fine. I don't think that
yeah.
anybody cares really. If we try to do this kind of activism
In Russia,
in Russia, I think I think it's not just our careers would be threatened. I mean, we probably go to
live.
jail, or we'll
Yeah,
just disappear, basically, right?
yeah. It's a real, yeah, real, different world. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and so yeah, so on your point, I mean, about can sociology thrive?
yeah.
Um, well, I mean, so clearly, I mean, our tribe, you could say the academic, the intellectual tribe, we have a vested interest in free speech. We have a vested interest in open discourse. Um, because if that gets restricted, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, restricting oxygen to like a top athlete, right?
Hmm.
So if we could just say, oh well, you can only breathe so many times if you're trying to make your sprinting, right? Um, it would be catastrophic. I mean, we would have to
Yeah.
switch your careers, and that's why I mean I find it very interesting that this you know the smartest people, I mean, in the Soviet Union, they did have a very good education system, and they would usually be channeled into the professions. So you would have like engineers, right? Because the Soviets revered engineers because they were the ones that know how to make machines work and stuff. Um, and they would and their job would be in the factory as an engineer, and then maybe at home they would read and write poetry, and maybe even critical political essays that might get distributed within certain like literary circles, right? um you know yeah, there would be like limited forms of outlet. um yeah, but they wouldn't be academic sociologists, right?
Hmm.
Like in a liberal democratic society, I mean, they would have probably, you know, gone to graduate school in sociology or in political science or history or any of these fields, uh, and uh, and then they would stay within that academic track.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that that was not an option, you know, back in the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Um, and you could say, yeah, today's Russia. I mean, that's definitely not a feasible
Possible.
direction to go
Yeah.
towards. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I was also arguing about like this kind of domino
Effect.
theory.
Yeah.
So what if Ukraine falls? I mean, does it mean that that other countries in Europe could follow after that? And I would say it's really, I mean, it's a differentiated yes and no to some extent, right?
Mhm.
Because
Lithuania, for example,
yeah, well,
or
I mean,
any Baltic states, or Moldova, right?
yeah, so the context in which I say this obviously is based off of
Yeah.
Trump's speech to basically pull the US out of NATO,
Uh,
and basically threaten the non-defense of NATO allies who are not paying their fair share, as he calls it.
mm.
Um, yeah, so on the one hand, I mean, Putin would probably be aggressive, uh, because if you don't stop him, he will just keep going, right? I mean, it's always been like that.
Mhm.
And so countries like Moldova. So if Ukraine falls, and you'd have Moldova, then you'd have Georgia. Now with the Baltic states, this is going to be a big question, right? Because the best thing that he could do is he could try to do hybrid warfare, right? Like attacks over like the internet or the electric grid, um, um, or like explosions here and there or whatever in Tallinn or something like that. Um, I'm not sure whether he would be able to do full scale hostilities, um, because the UK and France, they're still nuclear powers. They would be part of NATO even without the US. Um,
What do you
so
think about Sweden? About Sweden is in NATO now, right? But there was this threat, at least from Sweden. They thought that they would be on the list uh, because of their, energy sources. Well, not just that, but they were not in NATO before, but now they joined NATO. So what do you think of like Nordic countries, like even Finland up there? Would that be a big no-no? Because now Finland is in NATO too, I believe, right?
yeah, it's the
Yeah.
same logic. Now, I mean, the thing is that the benefit of NATO is going to be much less if the US was not part of it, because 70% of the military spending comes from the United States. So, um, Finland and Sweden, they had some level of protection under the European Union, um, which in its treaties is primarily an economic and a political union. It's not a military union. Um, but there would be some measure of assistance that would come from the other EU member states in the case of war. But clearly, I mean, the point of NATO membership is about US protection, right?
Have you also read about or watched this thing, bilateral relations that France and Ukraine are forming? And even here recently, Germany has established bilateral. But as far as military assistance, so they're trying to, even though Ukraine is not in NATO, France has sort of said, we got your back. They have this bilateral agreement that goes beyond the NATO agreement.
Yeah, so I
Uh,
did read the
yeah.
summary of the German-Ukrainian agreement, and I
Is that,
think probably,
is you think it has any, I mean, could that actually work? You could
yeah, I
just,
also read.
yeah,
So basically, I mean, so there were
yeah,
three agreements. So
yeah.
UK, France, Britain, each
Hmm.
with Ukraine. And as far as I understand, there is no new thing that is happening
Oh, it's
within
just a
that
piece of
treaty,
paper. Okay.
right? I mean, basically, I mean, all it says is
Uh,
that we, meaning the Western European countries, are going to support um, Ukraine for as long as it takes,
mhm.
and that in case of a re, so if we are able to repel the Russian aggression, in the case of a re-invasion by Russia against Ukraine, they would basically reactivate their level of military support. But look, but they're already doing it, right?
Yeah.
So it would
Weapon.
not go beyond what they're currently promising to Ukraine. The qualitative difference that would matter for Ukraine's fate would be a NATO membership for Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
Where I mean, hypothetically, right? If NATO collectively decided, which they're not going to do, but if they decided to integrate Ukraine into NATO, into the alliance as a full member, where they're saying basically where they're communicating to Putin, up until this date, you can basically do whatever you want in Ukraine. If beyond that point, so the day that Ukraine joins, you do not depart from Ukrainian territory, then we as NATO would have to fight a war with Russia
Article
directly.
5. Article 5, right?
It would be the Article 5, yes.
Yeah.
So it would be that decision. And now here's an important question, right? So if that were to happen, I mean, would Putin back down ultimately?
Or
Um,
use nukes.
or would he
No.
or would we be using nukes? I mean,
Yeah.
there is a possibility that he could back down. Um, where it's like, you know, if it was if we are getting to the nuclear brink, um, you see, there was this. So Putin recently argued that he prefers Biden over Trump in the presidency, even though you might say that Trump is better for Putin because Trump is not committed to NATO, and he's not committed to Ukraine either, right? So he's the one who's pushing Speaker of the House Mike Johnson to block the funding package for Ukraine at this point. But so what Putin doesn't like about Trump is the unpredictability of Trump, right? So basically, a couple of days after he was saying he was going to throw Ukraine under the bus, right, by basically forcing them to negotiate for a peace agreement. Now all of a sudden he's saying, well, okay, I'm willing to give the Ukrainians 60 billion US dollars um, if it was made in loans as opposed to grants, right?
Hmm.
And it's just like all of a sudden he makes his 180-degree turn, right? Because he thinks, that's the art of the deal, right? You keep,
He flips.
upping the
Flip.
stakes. You
Yeah.
flip for whatever to
Okay.
opportunistically improve your chances, right?
Yeah.
Um, and um, and actually, I do think that Putin is very fearful of that. So, and look, I mean, there's no hard evidence for saying that Putin thinks this because of that reason. I mean, I'm not sure, but why was he not attacking Ukraine during the Trump presidency? I mean, because
Hmm.
well, so under the Obama administration, there was no weapons, no American weapons that entered Ukraine. Right? It was Biden. Sorry, it was Trump who started the Javelin missiles. Started by Trump,
Hmm.
and so at that point, I mean, yes, the Ukrainians would have been the most vulnerable at that point, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't
Um,
know.
and really,
Spontaneous, I guess. It happens spontaneously. You know? No?
so if I was like Vladimir Zelensky, the most cringeworthy moment
Mm,
before the February 22 invasion was when Biden gave a speech somewhere. I think it was in Europe, maybe in Poland or something. I'm not sure, but he made a statement where he said that the U.S. will not defend Ukraine. Uh, well, the U.S. would supply weapons, but would not use U.S. troops to fight the Russians. This was a really cringeworthy moment. I mean, because I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, I mean, from Putin's perspective, he thinks this was a great moment
mm,
because Putin believes that Biden will keep his word, and because Biden keeps his word, and he did keep his word. I mean, the U.S. has not declared war on Russia, right?
mhm,
So Biden kept his word. Now the problem is that the Ukrainians are the ones who are paying for it, right? They're suffering for it now.
mhm.
Um, Now, but but I'm not going to criticize Biden on that decision because look, from a global security perspective, I do believe that having leaders who keep their word,
It's important. Yeah.
yeah, that is important, right? Because it's about calculability, right? Calculability of the next steps. If I cannot calculate your next steps, I mean, we could have a nuclear holocaust tomorrow.
Mhm. Unhinged. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you saw this episode, right, where
Mhm.
from one moment, right, where Trump says that Kim Jong Un is like Rocket Man, and I'm gonna nuke the shit out of him, right?
Mhm.
And then the next moment,
He's
he meets him on the border, right, in North
uh,
South Korea, and
the
gives him a big hug.
yeah, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So in that sense, I mean, but okay, so that's interesting, but because then some people would say, well, that for so if Trump is that proverbial madman in terms of global politics. And the madman has scared off the dictator, right? So Putin. Then should we not desire to have Trump back into the presidency? But I mean, to me, it's like
That's too much,
uh,
too much. Go ahead.
well, I mean, there's a presumption that that foreign policy is the only reason why he should be in power. I mean, that would be my first objection. I mean, I think there's a lot of other problems regarding domestic policy where he wants to do concentration camps for undocumented migrants and stuff. So did so that would be the first, and then the other objection is again that do you want to undertake the risk? Where if you assume that Putin wasn't going to back down, yes, we could have a nuclear holocaust, right?
Definitely, yeah. It's a risk. Yeah, yeah.
I'm describing that way of thinking for Putin, and his preference for Biden without necessarily saying that that we should support Trump because of that, right? Um, you know, I mean, but it is an intractable situation. And I followed the frontline situation and Avdivka. I mean, the down in the east in the Donbass
Hmm.
is basically fallen. And the Ukrainians are pushed out of that city. I mean, that was one of the main fortifications on the Donbass. Um, they had to give it up. They just
That's why
don't have
one of the generals was removed, I think. Zelensky removed the top commander or something.
Zaluzhny. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was
Um,
something going on militarily.
yeah. So
Definitely.
there's a difference in emphasis, basically, where I think you know. So Zaluzhny was an open communicator. I mean, he was saying that look, the Ukrainian army is struggling. We do not have the resources. We're going to have to, if you want to preserve the Ukrainian army, that is to say, have minimal amount of troop losses, you're going to have to do a fighting retreat, right? So a fighting retreat basically means that you keep pulling back to defensive fortifications further in the interior of the country, and that way you gradually exhaust the resources of your enemy, so the Russians, um, and you're able to preserve your own army, so that by the time that you're trying to do the counteroffensive, you're going to have the manpower to last. Um, and and I think Zelensky's position was kind of like, well, deal with it, right? So even if you have munition shortage, try to stay in your trenches. You try to hold every inch of land. And then Sersky is the new guy in charge, and he was kind of agreeing more with President Zelensky, because Sersky was trained within the Soviet Union, and
Hmm.
he sort of accepted the battle plan, which is basically to hold every inch of land. Um, but I don't know. I mean, it looks like that he's quite pragmatic now at this point, because he has pulled back out of Avdivka. So they are interested to keep to preserve the manpower. Um, and and look, I mean, I don't think it's really a personality game here between Zelensky, Zelensky, and Sersky. I think there's a resource shortage.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw that the average age of the Ukrainian army is like 45 now.
Oh, wow.
You don't have like the young men in the 20s to fight, right? Um, so they're running low on the manpower. They're running low on the munition for sure. The Russians are able to bomb them 24/7 at this point. And the Ukrainians are not able to hold the positions or do a counterattack because of a lack of munitions. Um, so the thing that would make a difference would be if the Americans passed the military aid package, right?
Yeah.
Because the U.S. still has some stockpiles to keep going. It also has a significant amount of ammunition stocks. The Germans, interestingly, they built a new
I saw that.
ammunition facility, right?
Schultz, yeah, I visited it. Yeah. Photo op. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And
That's
so
that military Keynesianism what we were talking about a few podcasts ago. You know, spending in the which may help the industry in Germany too. I mean, the defense industry. A lot of yeah.
yeah,
So
we were seeing earlier the deindustrialization, right? In Germany, it started with the pandemic, and there was a slight recovery, and then after the Ukraine war, that's when you saw the industry's nosedive. So um, it would be good to have some amount of military Keynesianism
mm,
to revive the economy. Um, that would, I mean, yeah, if you look at yeah, I mean the precedent within Nazi Germany, right? I mean, where there was a significant 25% unemployment, right? And um, and there was a reason why Hitler was so popular, at least in the early years of the war. He was transforming into a war economy, um, and that created full employment because the men were in the army or they were in the weapons factories. Um, but I mean, anyway, so the main logic I think, from a geopolitical standpoint, is that yes, Germany feels very uncomfortable trying to be the leader um, in that Ukraine conflict. They always want to hide behind the U.S. And I believe that for the first 2 years of the war, that probably worked. hiding
Mhm.
behind the US.
But not
Uh,
anymore.
yeah, right now, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's many political leaders now in German politics. I mean, they were like, well, look, the U.S. If the U.S. is not on the side of Ukraine, it's going to be a conflict between Germany and Russia. I mean, German industrial power versus the Russian one. The Russians at this point they have a bigger military economy because they're literally throwing everything they have into this war. Um, the Western Europeans they still have guns and butter, basically, right? They're not really, you know, they're not acknowledging the trade-off, right? I mean, they're kind of well, you have to keep your own population satisfied, and then we have to spend a little bit more in the military, right? Um, the exceptions I would say would be the Baltic countries and Poland. Poland invests much more in the military now. Um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, it will be an industrial conflict between Germany and Russia. And in the Lance Brecht podcast, I mean, Brecht kind of makes the argument that the Germany will not be able to shoulder all of these costs. Um, I disagree with that viewpoint. I mean, of course, it's not going to be Germany by itself. I mean, you would have to bring the French, the Italians, the British, the Scandinavians. You have to bring them all into that coalition, right? But 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 yes, I mean, in terms of the relative industrial capacities, the lion's share would have to come from Germany. And I know, and it has been very uncomfortable to do so because of the Nazi history. Um,
Yeah.
but who else is going to do it? I mean, there's no other power outside of the U.S. that would be strong enough or interested enough, right? I mean, the only other major power would be China, but China clearly is backing Russia, and and they were actually saying to the West that they should stop supplying the weapons to Ukraine,
Mm.
which tells you the alignment that they have, the
Yeah.
geopolitical arena.
So definitely. That was a good summary. Yeah, I think we'll figure it out in the next few months what happens, and we'll have, or next few weeks, we'll have another podcast
That's for sure. Yeah, yeah.
on
Okay. Well, then,
another.
thank you very much, Mike,
Yeah,
for joining me on this
yeah.
podcast.